That is when life and work became hard. So, before the fall, we see the example of the Sabbath. We see that God is saying, work in these 6 days and then have a day of rest in which to honor me. And he did that even when work was enjoyable. He still wanted Adam and Eve to do it back then. It was a blessing to them back then. But after the fall, after work became more difficult, it was a very special blessing. Here is a day when a little bit of that curse is removed. Here is a day when I am going to bless you. Here is a day when it's not going to be so hard. This is the day that you're to take off and you're to honor me. We need to think back to creation. We need to remember it. We need to remember that this day of rest is not a burden. It's supposed to be a blessing to us and to our families. We were created with this need to worship our God on the seventh day. We were created with a need for rest and a need for God. And so we need to take the day off and spend it with God. Now let's look at rest, the day of rest in Old Testament Israel. And we're going to look at the fourth commandment specifically, but we're also going to think about the context of the fourth commandment. The context is going to be very important. We need to remember that Israel is this nation that has been set free from slavery for God's purposes. And so as Moses is teaching the people about the Ten Commandments, and he's teaching them how to apply the Ten Commandments, he is doing so with respect to what they have been through and thinking about what is coming for them. And as he's teaching about the fourth commandment in the book of Deuteronomy, he adds a very important phrase. This is what he says. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So there's this very important relationship that exists between the time in Egypt and the fourth commandment, something that we need to see. And the people of God are to remember what it was like when they were in Egypt, and that is to motivate them to keep this day of rest. So what was it like when they were in Egypt? Think back. You know the story. When they were in Egypt, they were slaves, and they were doing all of the things that Pharaoh wanted them to do, and it was very difficult. And so the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. They were not doing all of the easy work, but they were doing all of the hard stuff. If there is a slave owner, then he is going to want his slaves to do all of the things that he doesn't want to do. He's going to want his slaves to do the things that are extremely difficult, and that in Egypt was making bricks. And so the people in Israel were making all the bricks that they could possibly make. They were hard pressed and they were groaning. And then what did Pharaoh do? He said, make me some more bricks. And just to be mean, he said, I'm not going to give you any straw, but you're going to have to go out and you're going to get all of your own straw. And he set the taskmasters over them. And if they would be beaten if they would not get all of the bricks that Pharaoh wanted them to make. And so that's what it was like for them. And during this particular time in Israel's history, for hundreds of years, they were probably not able to take off a day for worship. That is reasonable to assume. It is reasonable to assume that the slave owner, Pharaoh, did not let them have Sunday off to worship their God. And when Moses comes before Pharaoh, the first thing that he brings up is this idea. He says, God has said this, God is telling you to set these people free, or to let these people to go out into the wilderness in order to worship me. That's what he says in Exodus chapter 5, verse 1. Paraphrased a bit. So, God wants his people to be able to worship him as he has called them to worship him. So when God sets his people free, when he takes them up out of the land of Egypt, then he is doing so in such a way as to ease their burden, and he is doing so in such a way as to give them a day in which to worship them. This day is to be a joy for them, not some sort of a heavy burden. And it should be a joy for all of us as well. There is nobody here that has ever been a slave. Don't make yourself a slave either. God, the great God of the universe, has set you free, and has set you free and given you this day off in which to remember Him. Don't say to yourself, I have to work all 7 days. Don't tell yourself that. It's not true. That's not what the God of the universe says. You're going to be tempted to work all the time, but you need to give yourself a break. And God has given that to you. So when we're looking at the fourth commandment, one of the things that we notice is that remembering is very important. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The people are to remember what it was like when they were in Egypt, but they're also to remember something else. They're to remember something that happened much earlier on in history. They're to remember the time in which God created. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and He rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. When you look there at the end of the fourth commandment, then it explains to you what the people were to remember. What are you to remember? You're to remember the Sabbath day. And that is described there in verses 11. In verse 11, rather. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. That is what they are to remember. So let's think very carefully about that. Let's think about that slowly. He rested on the seventh day. That's what they're to remember. What is that talking about? Well, they are to remember the day in which God rested. The last day after creation. The last day in the week. That time that we talked about in Genesis chapter 2. That is what it talks about in verse 11. It says that God rested on the seventh day. Now look at the very last part of verse 11. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. What Sabbath day are we talking about here? It's talking about the Sabbath of man, the day of rest for man. The day of rest that was set apart and regarded by God as the holy day. They are to remember what God did in creation and how that was to be a model for them, and they are to act accordingly. They are to rest on the seventh day, and they are to worship God. This is important because this is an idea that a lot of people attack in our day. There are a lot of people that don't look at this commandment like they should. And so that's why I want to spend some time talking with you about it. At the beginning of the sermon, we said that secular governments and employers often desire that Christians disobey the fourth commandment. That has been true throughout history. But there is something that is very strange in our age. We see in our age that there are Christians, oddly enough, that don't want to obey the fourth commandment. And so the question is, why do they think that they can get away with that? Why do they think that they can ignore the fourth commandment? This is why. Pay very close attention. This is why people are going to tell you that the fourth commandment does not apply today. They say that the fourth commandment was a temporary law. It was a temporary rule. It is something that had validity during part of the time in the Old Testament, but it doesn't apply earlier before Moses' day, and it doesn't apply after Moses' day, and it certainly doesn't apply today. The way that they go about it is they say that God has rules and He changes as time goes on. So there's a set of moral rules that apply during the time of Adam. There are a set of moral rules that apply during the time of Moses. And it goes on and on. And so each stage of history has a different set of rules. And so the Ten Commandments were the rules that applied during the time of Moses, but they're not the set that applies now. Now we have only one commandment, and that is the law of love, according to these people. They say that anything that we do that is loving is that which is required of us, and it's not clear that we must keep the Sabbath in order to be loving. And so it's obviously not one of those rules that applies to us. That is what people are saying. But you